Welcome, everybody. My name is Pablo Navarrete. Welcome to this latest Alborada online event. My name is Pablo Navarrete. I'm the founder, co-editor of Alborada, which is an independent voice platform on Latin American issues, politics, media, and culture. We've been going since 2009, and we if you go to our website, alborada.net, which is, you can see just above, you'll see that we published articles. We do a range of events, increasingly online since the pandemic began last March. This is our 12th event, I think. And today I'm really happy to have with me two journalists who have a lot of respect for, John McEvoy and Nathalia Urban, both journalists based in the UK, like myself, but who cover Latin America and other issues, other regions. Nathalia is a commentator, journalist based in Scotland, in sunny Scotland, and covers rights for Brazil Wire and for a range of other publications, broadcasts a lot to Brazil, covers also UK issues for a Brazilian audience. John McEvoy is an independent journalist whose writings have appeared in International History Review, in Tribune, in the Canary. In fact, we've got, there'll be a Canary event that I'm co-moderating in 2 weeks' time on the UK's role in essentially trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, supporting the US government's ongoing coup attempt in Venezuela. John's reporting for the Canary, for Declassified UK, has really been embarrassed the UK government, exposed what it's up to. So join us in 2 weeks' time. You can go to the alborada.net/events for more information on that event. So today we're discussing COVID imperialism in Latin America. As many of you might know, Latin America, the Americas, has been the region hit most hard, really, by COVID. At the beginning of March, I think there were more than 1.2 million deaths, more than 50 million cases. Brazil is a country with the second highest number of deaths in absolute terms in the world, more than 300,000. I think yesterday was the day where there was the highest number of registered deaths in Brazil, and obviously with the neo-fascist president Bolsonaro, whose approach to the pandemic has been, reckless, to put it mildly. It's one of the countries, suffering the most with the pandemic. But as with always is the case with Latin America, being the backyard, or the so-called backyard, of the US, there's a number of geopolitical concerns that are at play with regards to the pandemic, and that's what we're going to try and cover today. We've got, as I say, John and Nathalia, who have both recently written really fascinating articles. I think one was co-written with John that Nathalia did, but she's been covering the issue for a variety of publications on kind of geopolitics behind the pandemic in the region. So rather than carry on, I think the idea is to go to John first, then to Nathalia. I'd encourage people joining us on various platforms. I should say, actually, that we are going live on the Alborada YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter channels. And I would encourage you to put your comments in there. But also on Facebook, we're going live, hopefully, on a number of other pages. Telesur English, The Canary, Bywire, Brazil Wire, who are supporting the event. I'd encourage you to check out Brazil Wire, an excellent independent website. A friend of ours who's reporting on Brazil has been really, first rate, and puts a lot of the mainstream media to shame. So yeah, we're going live on a number of these platforms. I'll do my best to try and see where the questions are coming from. But as I say, there's about 8 Facebook pages that we're also streaming live from. So bear with me. I'll try to get to as many questions as possible. That's enough for me. I want to hand over to John, and I want John to tell us about this recent article that you published with the revelations about what the US government had kind of done with respect to Brazil and sort of trying to or successfully preventing them from trying to get the Sputnik vaccine from Russia. So over to you, John.
Yeah, for sure. And cheers for having us on Alborada, Pablo. And it's great to share this panel with Nathalia as well. Yeah, so recently it was on the evening of last Sunday at Brazil Wire. We published a piece basically outlining how the US had pressured the Brazilian government of Jair Bolsonaro to refuse the Russian Sputnik vaccine. So in the yearly Department for Health and Human Services report, and now this is under the Trump administration still in 2020, Trump's health secretary, Alex Azar, he opens the report, he's saying, this has been a terrible year, but finally there's some light at the end of the tunnel. We're finally seeing the rollout of vaccines, etc. However, on page, I think, 48 of this report, the US government flagrantly admits that in order to combat what they describe as malign influences in the Americas, that they had pressured the Brazilian government to reject the Russian vaccine. And now this is incredibly important, because what we're seeing at the moment in Brazil is one of the worst kind of humanitarian disasters with regards to coronavirus. As you said, over 300,000 people have died altogether. It's the second worst total amount of deaths in the world. If you look at the map of Brazil, virtually every single department has reached over 90% of its ICU capacity. They're trying to enforce, a 2-week lockdown just so the hospitals can get on top of the amount of people that are requiring beds at the moment. Simultaneously, the Brazil variant of coronavirus is about 2.5 times more infectious than the original variant of coronavirus. So yeah, in total, we've got this situation where the United States government is actually bragging openly about having convinced a neo-fascist in Bolsonaro to refuse to vaccinate the population with a vaccine that had been independently verified by a number of health organizations. Including the Lancet, for example. The Lancet, the main scientific journal, proved that it was about 95% efficient. And this is just to score a petty soft power point over Russia, as they claim to combat these malign influences. And in this case, a malign influence in US terms is defined as literally saving Brazilian lives. So this isn't just a Brazilian issue. However, this is definitely a regional issue, but also a global issue. Brazil borders on most of the countries in South America. Recently, Venezuela had to send oxygen tanks to the state of Manaus, because they basically couldn't keep up with the amount of patients that they're receiving, struggling with coronavirus. At the same time, Venezuela has recently announced that it's going to have to institute a 2-week lockdown simply because of the amount of people that are crossing the border with the Brazil variant of the coronavirus. So yeah, this decision by the US could have cost already tens of thousands of lives. It's impossible to quantify. And it's also impossible to quantify how many more lives will be lost because of this totally reckless decision on the part of both the US and the Brazilian government. At the same time as well, the US orchestrated this operation via its health attaché in Brazil, but the US has health attachés all across the world as well. In India, in South Africa, and a number of other countries. And I think we can assume that these health attachés are up to similar tricks in these countries as well. So I don't think this is simply an issue of the US pressuring Brazil not to accept the Sputnik vaccine. This could be happening all over the world at the moment. And in a wider sense, this is definitely an infringement of Brazilian sovereignty. But if we look at this contextually, Jair Bolsonaro is the product of a US-backed soft coup in Brazil. I mean, a major reason why he's in power at all at the moment is because the US Department of Justice, the FBI, and a number of other US state departments colluded in a soft coup in Brazil, both to remove Dilma Rousseff from power in 2016, to have Lula, the presidential frontrunner, jailed before the election in 2018 that led to the rise of Jair Bolsonaro to power. So you've got this kind of this long-standing infringement of Brazilian sovereignty that's been damaging, totally unquantifiable measures. Just to continue, another kind of example of Brazil signing away its sovereignty in this case is recently we saw a number of developing countries bring to the World Trade Organization asking for there to be a patent waiver on the vaccines. Now, a number of countries, you can look at the map, and it's basically the same countries that recognize Juan Guaido. It always replicates the same map. The US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, most of Western Europe, all voted against waiving patents on the vaccine, so that basically developing countries have to buy these vaccines off the US, the UK, Germany, etc., rather than sharing the technology and the medical or the intellectual information in order to produce them themselves. And the only country in Latin America that voted against this patent waiver is, unsurprisingly, Brazil. So we've seen like various instances of Brazil totally subservient to US power, combined with the total idiocy of Jair Bolsonaro in general, which has to be mentioned. So yeah, I mean, the situation that Brazil is in at the moment is the culmination of US imperialism, and I mean the effects that we're seeing of it at the moment totally disastrous.
John, before I move to Nathalia, now this article that you published in Brazil Wire, I mean, the revelations are pretty kind of striking. I think if you swapped the US government with the Chinese government, and you swapped Brazil with another country, you'd suspect that it would be pretty big news in the UK. Now, I mean, I'm going to bet that you're not surprised that this hasn't received more media coverage in the UK. But tell us a little bit about how, in that context, why? I mean, what's your evaluation of why a story such as this is essentially? I haven't seen it really beyond your article. I don't. I think it's made some waves in Brazil, and maybe Nathalia can tell us more, or John. But I mean, in terms of the kind of coverage we've received in the UK about these types of revelations, what explains the kind of limited amount?
Well, as a kind of rarity with regards to this article, it actually received quite a lot of exposure, especially in the US. I mean, the Washington Post ran with it, Reuters, and a number of major outlets in Brazil ran with it as well. It was on the main news channel at 6 p.m. in Brazil, where they questioned the US ambassador about it, and he basically denied the facts that were contained within a US government report, which is the kind of farcical nature of US denialism. However, yeah, I mean, you raise a very good point about, I suppose, how these kind of, well, I'm not sure they're criminal under international law, but they at least should be. These kind of heinous acts that result in tens of thousands of deaths are framed in a totally different way if the US is responsible for doing it than if, say, for example, China or Russia had done it. Now, in this case, there's far greater evidence to suggest that the US is basically using vaccines as this arm of soft diplomacy. It doesn't want to let Russia, or it doesn't want to let Cuba, or it doesn't want to let or China or any official enemy have a successful vaccine rollout in the developing world, because that will to the US, and it will score them a soft power victory. Whereas at the exact same time, I mean, we saw an article in the Wall Street Journal saying that China was up to the exact same thing that there is documentary evidence for the US doing. and it was framed in these terms of, oh, look at what China's doing. This is totally unacceptable. This country has no respect for human life, and we should basically totally reject any form of vaccine or any form of soft power that they try to extend across the world. So yeah, I mean, when you see these types of stories, and I mean this, when you see these stories as well, it's also an example of total projection on the part of US journalists and the US state. Things that the US state does frequently, I mean, just does all of the time. It constantly accuses, like meddling in elections, for example, and we saw Russiagate, where there's this total wild paranoia about Russia meddling in US elections without any real credible evidence, as Aaron Mate reported very well on. So you see this constant source of projection on the part of US journalists and the US state, and that is framed within the US media in a way that it would never be when the US does the exact same thing.
Thanks. Nathalia, before I ask you to talk a little bit about the article that you co-authored, also in Brazil Wire, about the UK's role and relationship with Jair Bolsonaro. I'm interested because I was speaking to a friend in Brazil just yesterday, I think, and even though the Brazilian press, I mean, there are elements of it that have been critical of Bolsonaro. He was saying that this story essentially hadn't really, really cut through in Brazilian society, and that ultimately the Brazilian press, even though that there has been criticism of Bolsonaro because he is this kind of neo-fascist, he's not kind of ideal candidate for them. Given the threat of Lula, I think, especially now, given the developments there and the possibility that he can run again next year, that they're very wary of being too critical, and they're desperate to look for a kind of more respectable right-wing candidate. So I'm curious, this story, how do you evaluate the way it was received in Brazil? Did it sort of puncture Jair Bolsonaro's popularity? And yeah, how would you evaluate, what most, left-wing analysts and other analysts have said is a disastrous, almost genocidal policy approach to managing the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think for those who are already against Bolsonaro, and especially from the left-wing spectrum, we were not surprised to know that Bolsonaro put the interests of the United States, of the UK, or any European country in front of the welfare of the Brazilian people. Basically, Bolsonaro is someone that saluted the US flag once. He's someone that is not he does not hide the fact that he's not a nationalist. He's actually I think his biggest frustration is not being from the United States. He's not someone that really loves Brazil. He actually aims to be a United States politician and to make Brazil the new Puerto Rico or something like that. So it was not surprising, but it was another chapter of showing Brazilians that we cannot trust Western countries, that they are playing games, dangerous games with our lives again, including in the midst of a pandemic that has killed over 3,000 people only yesterday in Brazil. So it's quite complicated because people are so in a state of desperation in Brazil that they simply are just tired of discovering things about Bolsonaro and discovering how this government is really genocidal, and they are simply tired. I think the Brazilian society is tired of being afraid, and it is a moment to be afraid. It is a moment to be scared, because the government is basically the latest thing in Brazil is the government is shifting things to pretend that not as many people are dying as they are, because they are changing the metrics of counting dead bodies that died because of COVID. So instead of actually doing something. The government is trying to hide bodies, literally hide bodies. And so I think that when you say, well, the United States want you to not have the vaccine because it's from Russia or it's from China or it's from whatever, people are just like, yeah, but Bolsonaro is the one to be blamed because he's the one that in the end has the ability to say yes or no.
But do you think he's going to, you would expect with all this that his political popularity would be plummeting, and some say it is, but then others say, you know, he's got the capacity to re-engineer a base, that he's a very skilled politician. That how do you see his kind of political fortunes going forward in the context of this sort of calamity that he's presided over?
Well, to say that he's not a skillful politician, never, like he was ever a skillful politician. The thing is, we have a media in Brazil that it was more willing to give a chance to Bolsonaro than to accept the fact that Lula made that the Workers' Party did a great government, did a revolutionary government in the most left-wing government that Brazil already had. So they rather to endure. In the past, they were like more willing to accept Bolsonaro than to try to work with Lula again. But they saw that Bolsonaro was even worse than even then one were expecting. So now we have a major crisis where like even like rich people are dying. Brazil became a pariah, international pariah. The country is literally exporting new types of virus, new mutations of viruses. Now there is a new mutation that has been found in Bahia that apparently it's not a mutation that is resistant to any mechanism of immuno responses from the body or vaccines. So it's a super dangerous mutations. And we have Bolsonaro that only now, yesterday, he did a TV announcement saying that the government is very concerned about the status of people dying of COVID-19 in Brazil, that they want to change things, that they want, that they are working with hospitals and doctors and governors, which they are not. They are actually not. Bolsonaro tried legally to stop governors to close their states, to close to negotiate vaccines with other laboratories around the world, including with Russian laboratories. So Bolsonaro did everything he could to mess things up for the regional leaders. And now that there is a situation of when Brazil is totally isolated, when the country became a bubble of COVID mutations and people are dying all over, that he decided that he has to do something. And now he's not a science denier anymore. Now he's someone that is working with doctors, even though he was until I don't know days ago saying people should have a hydroxychloroquine and go to work like it's any other day. So what Bolsonaro is doing now is trying to not clean, but like hide his mess a little bit, because there's no way no one can even pretend that they want to stay by him, or even internationally speaking, to make business with Brazil, because Bolsonaro's name became a liability. So he has to do something, otherwise he won't be able to maintain himself in power, because no one else wants to touch Brazil. Brazil became it's a patient zero of the pandemic now.
Could you tell us a little bit about?
Just an information, it's important to say that Venezuela just closed down the country for 14 days because of Brazil, because of the mutant virus from Brazil was found in Venezuela. So they had to close down their countries all over because of Brazil. Literally, it was because Brazil. Maduro said so in a national announcement on Sunday that they were closing down because of Brazil. So the country is not just, Bolsonaro is not just dangerous for Brazilians, but he's also like killing other people from South America as well.
Yeah, no, that's an important point, and I think the pandemic has really exposed how, how in states, where neoliberalism has been enacted for a number of years, how the absence of the state to respond, to provide the institutions, the financing, the resources has really meant that this pandemic. I mean, the crazy thing is we're talking about Brazil being, things are awful, and 3,000 dead yesterday and 300,000 dead, but it's still, when we look at the per capita figures, Britain is still like 7th or 8th highest number of dead, and Brazil is still like 18th or 19th according to the John Hopkins University figures. And there is, you see in that top 20 a lot of neoliberal states where where governments have basically quote unquote left it to the market to handle the to organize society. And what we're seeing, this pandemic's really exposed how these states are unwilling or unable to deal with pandemics such as this public health crisis. And only actually in countries that are neoliberal, like Chile, like Britain, but that have a history of strong public health institutions. It's been these institutions, for example, in Britain, with the vaccination program, when it was left to the private sector to the test and trace, it was an absolute shambles and corruption and 37 billion pounds. But only because these institutions that were created under left wing, under social democratic governments, have really salvaged neoliberal states in Europe and in Latin America. Anyway, we are going to talk about other cases, Cuba, I think, Argentina with Pfizer. But I just want to come back to that question about also discussing the UK, your article, and what the UK government, its relationship with Bolsonaro and the lobbying efforts that it's been doing. Because what's interesting for me is that the AstraZeneca, if I understand correctly, is the cheapest vaccine. I think there was a recent article that exposed the prices per unit, and it was £1.80, and compared to the Pfizer, which I think was £12, or at least that's what the European Union were buying at. This was disclosed momentarily by an official and then deleted. But the interesting thing is that the AstraZeneca, as far as I understand, is a kind of, has been produced not for profit, but the UK government has been using it as a kind of instrument to sort of soft power of imperialism, essentially, to get into Latin America in order to sort of sell other interests, perhaps, that it wants to push, corporate interests. So tell us about your article and the UK government and its relationship to Bolsonaro and the AstraZeneca link.
Well, basically 4 months before the elections, the presidential elections in 2018, the then ambassador of Britain in Brazil, he wrote Bolsonaro a personal letter inviting Bolsonaro to have a meeting in his house with strategic partners that were like British companies in Brazil, to lobby those companies for Bolsonaro, who was by the time still a very a wild pony, someone that you wouldn't bet your anything on him. And this is not surprising because we have been publishing about the relationship of the Tories, especially the Tories, with Bolsonaro for a while. But the thing is, how the things unfolded after the elections with the British are weird, because Bolsonaro has been criticized in Brazil and by the international press, even like the mainstream media, for relying on AstraZeneca for almost 1 year. Like Bolsonaro refused to the offers that he had from Pfizer, and of course he used the opportunity of vaccines to make racist and anti-communist points about China, saying that he would not take any Chinese vaccine, and accused the governors of, especially the governor of São Paulo, which he is a very neoliberal person, João Dória, and he accused João Dória of being a communist for like purchasing the Chinese made vaccine for the state of São Paulo. So Bolsonaro relied for almost 1 year solely on AstraZeneca. Bolsonaro paid a lot of money to Oxford AstraZeneca. And even though that the time when he signed the contract, which was like on December 3rd, they did not have any sort of like reliable informations of about the vaccine, like how would when the timeline was very confusing. And the thing is, when you research things about like how AstraZeneca went in Brazil, you see that the national organizations that watch how the procedures, the medical procedures should go in Brazil, the medical testing should do in Brazil, they changed their protocols to fit AstraZeneca's timeline. Bolsonaro purchased the vaccine for a very high price. He paid 1.9 billion reais, which be something about like $350 million now, I think. And the fact that he spent all the time criticizing all the vaccines, like all the time, like saying like, oh, I can sign with them because their vaccine might be dangerous. Well, I won't sign with them because, well, they are Chinese, or I won't sign with them because their vaccine is expensive. With AstraZeneca, Bolsonaro never said anything, so which raises surprises of why he's trying to always flatter anything that is involved with the same companies that he has been invited to meet by one of his international partners, that is the Tory Britons. So it was very strange, because when Bolsonaro presented a vaccination strategy, because he was ordered to do so by the Supreme Court, the vaccine was, how can I say, many were concerned that Bolsonaro would continue to block the other vaccines to gain the registration to be used in Brazil. But AstraZeneca, that, okay, it's been used. I'm not a medical, but it is a vaccine that has been had her properties questioned by other medical authorities in the world, but in Brazil they were all cleared. Like they were the only one that since the beginning they have all they were accepted without any questions. So the homicidal negligence of Bolsonaro on choosing just one vaccine and saying after, when people questioned, that it was because Brazil was one of the biggest countries in the world, and that's how capitalism is. If the companies want to sell the product, they should go after Brazil. Like, it sounds stupid, because it is. Like, you in the middle of a world pandemic, you would think that laboratories have to chase you down to sell their vaccine. One should be the opposite. And only now, that after like several evidence showing that Bolsonaro refused to meet with laboratories, that Bolsonaro refused vaccines like the Sputnik, and to meet with Sinopharm, the Chinese pharmaceutical that is working in partnership with Butantan in the state of São Paulo. That Bolsonaro said that he never did that. That now that the Brazilian government is trying to buy all the vaccines, and because in the beginning he thought that the AstraZeneca would be enough, but it's showing that they might need more. And people are not like pressure, and you see that they are kind of pressured, that the British government have been pressured through their embassies and their diplomatic bodies in Brazil to show Bolsonaro, to make Bolsonaro continue to praise AstraZeneca, which is something that I would want my product linked to someone, especially if my product is a vaccine. I would want to have my product linked to Bolsonaro with someone that has been since the day one saying that if you have the vaccine, you will become a crocodile, or you're gonna become a woman if you were a man, because he said that as well, or that vaccine might kill you, that you have to just, I don't know, take chloroquine and not wearing a mask, because internet research told him that masks were unsafe. So we have now a situation where AstraZeneca is not...
Nathalia,
sorry.
No, I'm keen to move on a little bit because we've spoken about Brazil now for I think more than half of the event, and I'm keen also I know that we've got I want to talk a bit about also Pfizer and I know that you've been looking into this issue of Pfizer and also in Argentina, but before I go to that, I want to also, John, to talk a little bit about other countries, kind of perhaps a diametrically opposed example, Cuba, whose doctors are kind of, whose medical internationalism is well known. Who I think their doctors have been put forward for the Nobel Peace Prize, or for a Nobel Prize for what for I think 40. They have groups, missions in 40 countries at the moment, helping with to combat the pandemic. So tell us about the situation in a country such as Cuba that's facing obviously these sanctions by the US government pretty much since the revolution triumphed in 1959. Tell us about the situation in Cuba and the kind of geopolitics as well of what's taking place.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I know we're moving on, but I just did want to add very quickly to what Nathalia was saying that I mean the Oxford/AstraZeneca vaccine has recently just become the AstraZeneca vaccine. And leaked files from Brazil actually showed that they had a COVID period, and as of July, it was no longer not-for-profit. It was no longer within the COVID period, and from there on, AstraZeneca could actually make profit on their vaccine. So I think this not-for-profit, sponsored by the British state, idea is becoming a bit of a ploy. But yeah, to move on to Cuba, what was also contained in the US Health and Human Services report was that it also pressured Panama not to accept Cuban doctors into the country. I mean, the US and Panama have an interesting history altogether. I mean, the US effectively bought Panama for extremely cheap price off Colombia at the turn of the 20th century. In 1989, the US illegally invaded Panama, and now we've got another instance of the US kind of intervening in Panamanian internal affairs. So, I mean, the US basically, in exchange for this kind of US technical assistance, they pressured the Panamanian government to reject the offer of Cuban doctors. I mean, Cuban doctors have been going around the world, have been on the front line across most of the developing world, and also in Europe, in countries like Andorra, fighting the coronavirus pandemic. Even in March 2020, Cuban doctors were helping. I think there was a cruise ship of about 600 people, most of them British citizens, that wasn't allowed to dock in the Bahamas. The US rejected the ship. They said, you can't come here. So Cuba allowed them to dock. A number of Cuban doctors, I think around 50, attended to the mostly British kind of population of the ship. A number of Cuban doctors actually died following it as well from coronavirus, as this was sort of very early on in the pandemic. And the British government actually publicly formally thanked the Cuban government for this intervention. And aside from Britain, Cuba's sent about 50,000 doctors to almost 70 different countries. They've treated hundreds of thousands of people. In medical terms, Cuba's achieved incredible things in the context of the almost total blockade that it's been under since 1959, as you said. Cuban doctors. You often see in the media different stories about Cuban doctors that they're supposedly sent to different states to infiltrate them with communist ideology, etc. We've seen it in Venezuela. They've been the subject of terrorist attacks during the Guarimbas in 2014 and 2017. They've been attacked. Some of them have been killed simply for this kind of rampant anti-communism that is all throughout Latin America and the US, which is just a vestige of the Cold War. This kind of symbol of Cuban internationalism, where they kind of export health, it kind of terrifies the US. Every single US election that you see, the kind of ghost of Castro is risen again, because this Cuban internationalism, in a symbolic sense, is a threat to US capitalism. It kind of shows how a small country can become like a source of such obsession and fear within the US 60 years on from the revolution, because it offers a different logic of international relations, and you've seen that totally throughout the entire coronavirus pandemic.
And can you tell us a little bit about the Cuban efforts at developing the vaccine, which aren't really we don't hear about Sputnik or the Cuban effort, or even the Chinese efforts much when people speak about the options, they just generally have a kind of a list of sort of Western backed vaccines.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed on Twitter for the past 2 weeks or so, since confidence in the AstraZeneca vaccine has decreased, I've just been totally inundated with these adverts via Twitter saying the AstraZeneca vaccine has been proven to be. You wouldn't get that in the case of Sputnik when the Lancet certified it. You wouldn't get it in any, and it shows how the Western countries are using this as a total weapon of soft power via these Silicon Valley institutions that are totally tied to the US State Department. But to talk about the Cuban vaccine, I believe they're going to be they're in the second round of testing at the moment. So they've currently vaccinated about 100,000 people within Cuba, and they sent 50,000 vaccines to Venezuela, I believe, as well. They haven't completed the testing phase yet. But when they do, that'll be the first country in all of Latin America and the Caribbean to develop their own independent vaccine. And you can imagine once that's ready, that they'll use their resources, obviously, to vaccinate their own population, but in a totally contrary way to how the US, to how Britain and much of Europe have used vaccines. They will actually use it in terms of solidarity to the rest of Latin America to ensure that, to put human health in front of profit, which is an absurd notion to a lot of our good governments.
So, Nathalia, moving back south to Argentina, if I recall correctly, the Argentinian president Fernandez was vaccinated with Sputnik, with the Sputnik vaccine. But there's been a recent article that I was seeing about the kind of pressures, the outcry that was revealed because of Pfizer's strong arm or the kind of what were considered outrageous demands that they were asking of governments such as the Argentinian one with regards to the purchase of Pfizer vaccines. So tell us a little bit about what's been going on in Argentina with Pfizer.
Well, basically, when Fernandes refused the offer of buying the Pfizer vaccine, many of the corporate media accused him, like, made stupid comparison between him and Bolsonaro. But later on, many Argentinian official governments discovered that the Pfizer asked governments in Argentina and in Brazil, I have to say, I'm a journalist, I have to work with the truth, to put sovereign assets, including military bases and federal bank reserves, as collateral for potential future legal costs. Also, according to a medical doctor that works for the Argentinian government in the provincia of Buenos Aires, Dr. Jorge Rashidi, he gave several interviews saying that Pfizer demands in Argentina including even like fishing rights, which was ridiculous. Like, why they need fishing rights to sell us their vaccine? Like, we are not like asking for a favor. No, we are like gonna buy the vaccine. So a report made by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism showed that the Pfizer demands went beyond other companies or the COVAX facility that there is. The COVAX is the international bank that is that's going to start like distributing vaccines to the countries in the global south. But the issue with Pfizer is they were never very transparent about their intentions, and in Latin America, like with the public, the information about Argentina has been leaked because it's not the procedure. Like, they were like going way beyond their lines where it should go, to ask countries for like liability protections, not only against civil claims from citizens, but also for cases brought due Pfizer's own negligence, fraud, or malice. So, like, why would you want to put your people, like your people, on hands of a company like Pfizer? So Pfizer is a company that has been constantly talking, not talking, but they are like using what Boris Johnson today described as the strategies of successful capitalism and greed to ensure that their vaccine is not only going to cure, to prevent people to get the virus, but also like to make profits for their executives and their investors. In a meeting that they have in the beginning of the month, at the 11th of March, the high executives of Pfizer said that the people might need a third dose of their vaccines, to like a booster, to have a complete immunizations, and also that they might need annual booster for the immunizations of against COVID, which means that the company is going to sell more doses of the vaccine, which also means that they might also think about like raising the prices of the vaccine as well, because it is an opportunity. There is a report of the meeting that is available. It's not like conspiracy theory, like you can read everything on the report. So the fact that Latin America only has, so far, the region has like less than the doses of the vaccines necessary to immunize 3% of its populations, and almost all the doses of the vaccines are just distributing between four countries. it's very problematic. And while we have the international, the World Health Organization saying that it is a humanitarian and a world crisis, the European Union, the United States, Canada, the UK don't care. So they are using, their governments and their pharmaceutical companies are using this as an opportunity to get richer, to explore the desperation of the global south, especially Latin America, which, like you said, it is the most it's where you can see the with the most visibility of the cruelty of the virus, because it's not just killing people because of the disease, it's also killing people because of inequality. Like the virus is being a huge, tremendous, terrible thing for the economy, for the society, for the rights of people. And we don't have anyone besides Russia and China standing with us. Of course, Cuba is now, they have with AlbaTCP, they have a vaccine bank, which Cuba says all their vaccines will be available in that bank for the countries that are members of AlbaTCP. But when we have like Cuba and China like working with, like, to give vaccines for a badly affected area in the world, we have the Western media, the corporate Western media, saying that they are using as an opportunity to make political allies. So in their heads, and this is not something that I speak lightly of, it's quite painful for me as someone that is from Brazil to say, but they basically said that people it's better to have people in those countries like dying than to accept vaccines from Russia and China, because they are using as an opportunity to win friends and influence people. But when their companies like Pfizer try to abuse, not even like use, they are like trying to abuse countries to destroy their sovereignty to get a vaccine, which they will be paying a lot more than what is being charged by European countries to have the vaccine, they are wrong. So this is unacceptable, and this is something we should all, not just like us tonight, but we should all be debating about it.
No, completely. And I think there are organizations that are trying, or some kind of NGOs in the UK that are trying to expose this, but really the sort of the role of the UK, of the US, of the European Union in suppressing at multilateral agency level poorer countries in Latin America, countries in Africa, the ability to get cheaper vaccines is really an outrage. And I think it was the WHO Director General Secretary said it was on the brink of a moral catastrophe or failure, precisely because of this issue. And again, I think you're right that the lack of sort of reporting around this is kind of emboldens the governments in the UK and the US to sort of, they don't feel the pressure of public opinion, of media scrutiny on these issues. Now, I think we've whizzed through the hour. We're nearly actually at the end of it. There is a question on YouTube. I'm not sure if any of you know about this. I think the question is regarding the Sputnik vaccine, how much it costs per dose, and any idea how much Chile paid per dose for CoronaVac and other manufacturers of both these vaccines demanding the buyers assume liabilities as Pfizer and AstraZeneca. I'll put that to any of you if you have any information about that. I know it's interesting in the case of Chile that even though, again, another far-right government in Chile, they have actually bought a lot of people are being vaccinated in Chile with the Chinese vaccine, which is again, I'm no expert, but I think it's different. It was actually made or with the whole virus, and it's said to be quite robust, and certainly it's got a very high success rate. And a country such as Chile, which you would expect to be under the kind of heavy US influence, has bought a lot of Chinese vaccine. Again, it's probably because Chile's depends on China for so much of its trade, even though it's, you know, considered a key US ally. So I don't know if any of you have any information about that. I don't know what the Sputnik unit cost is, but I don't know if you have any comments around that. And then for the final 5 minutes, I mean, if I'll give you both a chance to sort of give some final observations on what we've discussed this evening. So, John, do you have?
I mean, I don't know how much they've paid per unit for the Sputnik vaccine. However, I mean, a lot of it actually just depends on the kind of trade deals that countries have with each other, and both if they're able to buy as a bloc, such as the European Union or Mercosur or whatever it is. So a lot of it basically depends. It depends on what kind of leverage they're able to have over these companies, and at the same time, a lot of the time the companies are forcing countries to sign non-disclosure agreements about how much they're actually paying for it, so that the next country, if they strike a better deal, and that they're not actually aware of how much someone else is paying for it. So there's not really much consistency with how much each country or each multilateral bloc is paying for the vaccine. So that's just to answer that question.
And can I, before I go to Nathalia, could you, I mean, no, actually, let's go to Nathalia on any of those questions or related issues.
Well, the data says that the vaccine, the Sputnik, is being sold by more or less $10 around Latin America, but like John says, there is a lot of like non-disclosure agreements, or like how much the countries are paying, or like and the price is changing now that there are like other laboratories, like including in Brazil, they are now like making the vaccine as well. So the costs of the vaccine are also changing, because they have like 15 laboratories all over the world that are making the vaccine as well. So it's hard to know precisely, especially about like Chile. I don't know how much like Chile per se is paying, but it is roughly around $10, which countries are paying for the doses.
And before, I mean, the final observations, I mean, I think you had something around Paraguay that you wanted to talk about. I mean, we don't have that much time, but I mean, either that or any other final sort of thoughts that you have.
Well, Paraguay is going through a difficult political moment. The people are in the streets because their government basically ignored the pandemic so far. The country does not have vaccines. The country does not even have like appropriate medical equipments to treat the population. And the people tried, the Congress, the opposition tried to bring the president down. They tried to vote an impeachment, which was rejected, since the president, Mario Abdo, has more than half of the parliament by his side. But the people are still in the streets protesting. Last week, they set the Colorado party, that is the party that is in power, on fire because they like the situation there is very serious. People are like really dying without any medical care whatsoever, or without any prospect of having a vaccine, because the country did not sign the COVAX bank. The country does not have trade agreements with other countries. And last week, Mario Abdo went to Brazil. His chancellor, went to Brazil to negotiate the exports of vaccines from Brazil to Paraguay. But the thing is, Brazil does not have vaccines enough for his own population. So I don't know what Bolsonaro promised to send something to Paraguay, but I don't know exactly what he has been promised. It was not said that was promised, what was promised and the quantities, but it's very difficult to believe that, and especially to rely on Brazil for anything in this particular moment of time. And one of the things is I was talking with the secretariat, the international secretariat of the Frente Iguaçu, that is the opposition, the leftist opposition of Paraguay. And he said something that was very interesting. He was like, why Mercosur did not try to buy vaccines like a bloc? Like, we know what's going on in Europe, but Mercosur is different because it's smaller, and especially because it is from countries that are not economical or political powerful like the countries in Europe. And we do not have like what's the point of Mercosur now? Like, they did not even try it to support each other in the time of need. And this is something we should all be those who are, of course, involved with Latin America should be questioning why Mercosur did not get involved with the obtain of vaccines as a bloc.
John, can I come to you for some sort of final thoughts on what we've discussed? Any points you want to reinforce, or yeah,
sure. I mean, I suppose what we've discussed about this for the last hour or so. I mean, we should really redress how we perceive capitalism. I think. I mean, this is basically a minor dress rehearsal. The coronavirus pandemic is basically a minor dress rehearsal for climate breakdown. The total catastrophe of coronavirus will be a speck on what we're due to see in the next century or so. Now, we don't start challenging the logics of capitalism, say, for example, with intellectual property to save human lives, with prioritizing human health over profits, then if we keep down this path, and it's going to end up in a dark place. It's a happy ending, but yeah, it is what it is.
Thanks, John. I'm afraid my internet was buffering a bit there, but we've gone a little bit over. But I think we're trying to be as strict with our timekeeping and keep it to an hour. So I just want to thank both of you once again for joining this latest Alborada. There's so many countries, so many issues that we didn't cover. We gave you a kind of insight into some of the dynamics at play, and some of the as John I think was saying, as we've discussed, that this idea that countries such as the UK and the US are really pushing the kind of profit over people line in Latin America, which is really to the detriment of lives. It's costing lives in countries such as Brazil and in many other countries. And so I think those of us in countries such as the UK and the US and in rich countries where our governments are sort of leaning against poor countries' ability to get these vaccinations, we really have to work towards making our governments change their positions. So, and also I'd like to say, obviously, the fact that these articles that we discussed at the beginning were published in Brazil Wire, an independent outlet that not only on this issue, but on the issue of, for example, on the sort of the fact, the jailing of Lula, effectively the stealing the Brazilian election by jailing Lula and the coup against Dilma. Brazil Wire was again one of the few outlets really telling us what was going on, and only now the so-called sort of left liberal media, who were so at best were equivocating on what was going on in Brazil, but really were apologists for what was clearly a coup. So I think it's important also to stress that independent media does need to support Brazil Wire, Alborada. It allows us to do more of these types of events, to do independent journalism, to do the investigations that the mainstream won't do. So do support us. Thanks again to the Facebook, to the organizations that are cross-posted this event, Canary, the Bywire, Brazil Wire, and numerous others. And yeah, I think there's comments in the Alborada YouTube and the Facebook to join the e-newsletter and to stay in touch. So this will be archived on our social media. Do share it, and yeah, we hope to see you at a future Alborada online. So thank you, John. Thank you, Nathalia, and join us for a future Alborada online.
Cheers.